Turn to Matthew 26. We're going to go to Matthew 26 in just a minute. But I want to say that one of the things that was exciting about last week was just meeting with other people from around the state of Washington, some people from Oregon. And the reason we came together was to celebrate the gospel as we understand it. And there were people from a variety of different backgrounds, even people from some different denominations. But the common denominator was this sort of unanimous agreement that when it comes to our relationship with God, we bring nothing to the table in that relationship other than sin, brokenness, need, and that God is the one who provides everything through Christ. And so that was the common denominator, and the whole conference was related to how we understand Christian growth in light of that. At any rate, it was, again, a great time. And I want to share a few things that are kind of spillover from that conference. One is a sort of a parable that one of my friends, Ryan from Oregon, he's a church planter down there. He read this, he wrote this and read this in the conference, and it helped me tremendously to think about what we describe all the time as this internal conflict between the flesh and the spirit, the old and the new. And this is his way of illustrating that truth. And I want you to please hear this, okay? And this will prepare us for what we're going to look at here in Matthew 26. So listen to this parable. And I want you to listen to it, and I want you to think about the character of God as you hear this. Sally and Larry married young. They had a tumultuous marriage filled with the ups and downs of most marriages. Sally felt she could never live up to Larry's demands, and no matter how hard she tried, she failed to fulfill his expectations. Larry, a former Marine, was a very matter-of-fact person. Everything for him was black and white, do this, don't do that. Everything was regimented, and you didn't dare deviate from his guidelines. Sally lived more in the gray and always felt that Larry was displeased with her. Despite her efforts to please Larry, she always felt short of his heavy-handed approach. She always felt that Larry was displeased with her. She always fell short of his heavy-handed approach. Sally desperately wanted Larry to love and accept her, but it seemed he was only pleased with her when she was doing what he wanted, and when she failed, he quickly removed his acceptance. Sally, who was raised in a very strict religious home, was not unaccustomed to this kind of paradigm. Her father, too, raised her to believe that if she did the right things, then she would be loved. If she failed, then she would be forced to try to make amends. After 25 years of marriage, Larry was diagnosed with cancer and died shortly after. Not long after Larry's death, Sally met Glenn. Glenn, unlike any person Sally had ever been around, seemed to accept Sally just the way she was. He seemed less concerned with changing her as he was with simply loving her and giving himself to her. His approval of her seemed less about what she did and more about his commitment and love for her. Sally, however, had a hard time accepting this kind of love from Glenn. She almost preferred Larry's ways because she didn't have to feel bad for his acceptance. She earned everything she got from Larry. Whereas with Glenn, she didn't have to strive or work that hard for his approval. In fact, he never criticized her or even had a harsh word for her. He just loved her. And unlike Larry, this love didn't seem connected to anything Sally did or didn't do, and this kind of bothered her. She remembered the times when when she really nailed it. The sense of satisfaction was exhilarating. She never felt this with Glenn. It was almost as if her behavior was not that important to him at all. He just loved her being around. He would constantly tell her how beautiful she was, even in the morning before she had a chance to fix herself up. He must be lying, she thought. He can't really mean these things. Larry only told me I looked good when I actually did, and so I believed him. Despite years of marriage to Glenn, Sally continued to live on the demands of Larry. When Glenn would ask Sally why she felt the need to please someone who is dead, Sally would respond, "He doesn't feel dead. I hear his voice in my head, and what he says makes sense. In fact, it makes more sense than what you say, because it gives me control of the outcome. With you, the outcome is always the same. In fact, it seems you're the one in control. You don't seem to be fazed by my behavior one bit." Glenn would lovingly pull Sally into his embrace and encourage her to trust his love, but it was very difficult for her. In fact, she would often visit Larry's grave and reminisce about their years together. Larry's impact upon Sally never left her, and despite the amazing marriage she had with Glenn, far better than anything she'd ever had with Larry, she still felt drawn to Larry. He felt very alive to her. His words of harsh condemnation were constantly reverberating in her ears. Try as she might to receive Glenn's words of comfort and grace, she had the hardest time allowing them to make any true impact upon her. She seemed to always gravitate toward Larry and the high expectations he placed upon her. She loved those insurmountable requirements he had placed upon her. It gave her goals to shoot for. It made progress tangible and something she could easily see in terms of the results. With Glenn, it was almost as if progress, goals, and results were taken off the table completely. And this made understanding how to please him very difficult. What do I need to do? Nothing, he would respond, but she really believed him. The freedom Glenn gave to Sally was so foreign to her that it was scary. She didn't feel free. She felt bound to everything she'd always known. Everything in her life was built on this performance paradigm, and as much as she wanted to be set free from its power, she kept running back to it like an old comfortable shoe that, despite its stench and tattered appearance, was still easy and familiar. Glenn wasn't easy. He wasn't either of those things. His approach was completely foreign to her. He spoke words that no one else had ever spoken to her, and this made Sally question whether any of what he said was really true. Where's the catch, she thought. So she lived out her days, married to Glenn, but simultaneously feeling pulled to the ever-present words of Larry that seemed to challenge everything Glenn ever had to say. This is the Christian experience, simultaneously being accused by the law and set free by the gospel. And I would say, in one sense, I'll try to be very precise how I say this, in one sense, almost preferring a God like Larry, who holds demands over us, so that we can keep working, striving, trying to attain goals. In essence, so that we can have some measure of control of the outcome. Which in that paradigm is something different from simply a relationship of love. What Glenn represents in that little parable is the true character of God. A God who offers to us through Christ unconditional love and acceptance. And what that parable also represents is our struggle to rest in that. To simply give thanks. To simply be amazed. To desire fruits, results of that, absolutely. But first and foremost, to be amazed by the nature of love that's been granted to us through Christ. And at some level, that is offensive to all of our human sensibilities. It is offensive. It takes control out of our hands. We don't like that. We want to be in control. In Matthew 26, we are at the last phase of Christ's life, okay? He has offered himself. And we could really say God has offered himself to the world now for 33 plus years. And most impactful would have been the last 3 years, Jesus' earthly ministry. He has offered himself, he's offered his perfect mercy, his perfect compassion, his perfect love, and we're about to see the human response to that. We see unconditional love extended to people, Christ making it very clear by going to the lowest of the low, the outcast, the ones considered the most sinful, completely false presuppositions behind that. Nevertheless, they were considered by society most sinful. I mean, he spent his time with them, offering himself, offering God to them. And we're seeing betrayal. This is the response to the offer of God, is betrayal. Read with me, start in verse 14 of Matthew 26, and we're just going to take this passage, we're going to break it down in the sections here, and it almost speaks for itself, but I'll say a few things to explain it, but it almost speaks for itself. But we'll just walk through and look at this Last Supper of Jesus and his disciples. And it begins with this betrayal of Judas. It says, then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me to betray him to you? And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver. From then on, he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. A couple things to say here. 30 pieces of silver, not that much. Different opinions as to what that would equate to today. At the most, a few $1,000s, maybe 4, 5, 6 grand at the most. Judas is betraying Jesus for, at the most, $6,000. Infinite worth of the Son of God, offering himself to Judas and everyone else. And this is the response. Exchanging him, and this goes right back to the root human issue, exchanging the value of God for the lesser value, and that's an understatement, the lesser value of things in this world, whether it's a piece of fruit as in the Garden of Eden, or 30 pieces of silver, or anything else in this world. Some remarkable things to consider here. Jesus, knowing all along this was going to happen, nevertheless, he allows it to play out. And he knows, because he's all-knowing, he knows what Judas is up to, but he allows it. Verse 17, now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. It's the well-known Passover. Remembering, looking back to when God delivered his people from Egypt, and the firstborn sons in Egypt were killed, and God's people, the Israelites, were miraculously delivered, and they had this celebration annually to reflect on what God did for them. And Jesus is going to experience this Passover meal with his disciples, and so they're preparing it, and the meal involves different elements, unleavened bread, as was mentioned, and there are different herbs, and there was wine, of course, and there were different foods and things to partake of together, and he's going to do that. And he's orchestrating everything. This is fascinating too. If you look in Luke's gospel, it says he sent the disciples, and he said to them, hey, you're gonna encounter a man who is carrying a container of water. And when you see him, say to him, we're going to have the Passover meal at your house tonight, sir. I mean, to think of God's sovereignty and his orchestrating the details, such that then when they enter into town there, they bump into this guy. And so that's what they're doing. They're preparing to have this meal with him, okay? Verse 20, now when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples. As they were eating, he said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me. Being deeply grieved, they each one began to say to him, surely not I, Lord. And he answered, he who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. The Son of Man is to go, just as is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. And Judas, who was betraying him, said, surely it is not I, Rabbi. Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. Again, pause here for a minute. This is fascinating to think about. The disciples are saying, wait a minute, who? What? Who's going to do that? Not me, not me. And one thing that tells us is they didn't know. They didn't know who the traitor was in their midst. Gosh, there's so many layers of this. They didn't know who the traitor was in their midst. Jesus knew. He didn't treat them any differently. This is the same meal when Jesus washed their feet, which means, guess whose feet he washed? Including the other 11, guess whose feet he washed? Judas's feet. I mean, even to these last moments, he's still extending grace to Judas, knowing what's coming. Didn't treat him any differently. And yet Judas, motivated by, human rebellion, rejection of God, motivated by his own greed, motivated by jealousy perhaps, motivated by disappointment that Jesus wasn't establishing the kind of kingdom of power that he wanted to be a part of. I mean, who knows? But he's conspiring. He's already made plans to turn Christ over. And in verse 24, Jesus says, the Son of Man is to go just as is written of him. This is God's sovereign plan, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. So we have the meeting here of God's sovereign plan, and yet it's coming from an evil person with evil motives. And of course, there's satanic inspiration behind this. And all this is happening according to God's perfect plan, according to God's perfect wisdom. Let's read a little bit farther from verse 26 to 30. While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So again, this is the Last Supper. This is the transition. This is when Jesus is beginning to explain to them, which they won't really fully understand till later, but he's explaining to them that he's offering himself. That the Passover looks back to what God did in the killing of the firstborn. It looks back to the establishment of the old covenant through Moses when bulls were slaughtered and the blood of those bulls was sprinkled on the people. And now Jesus is saying, look, I am offering myself. I am going to allow humans to murder me, to execute me. I'm going to shed my own blood. My own body is going to be broken for you. That's what is going to happen. This is the transition from those Old Testament, Old Covenant realities to New Covenant realities. And there are all these pictures involved, from Jesus being the true Passover lamb, far greater than any Passover lamb because he's a human being, a substitute who lived in our place. He's the unleavened bread. Unleavened bread represented sinlessness, untainted by sin. Jesus, the perfect sacrifice, completely sinless, offering himself. The wine representing, of course, the blood of Christ that would be spilled. There's so much to this. And here's where we stop and think, wow, I mean, what a scoundrel Judas was. Except that we end up reading something very similar about Peter. Following context, we hear primarily from other gospel accounts that Peter rejected Christ and betrayed Christ in a way not unlike the way Judas betrayed him, in a sense that he insisted that he didn't know him. And I think the reason that's there is for us to realize that, prepare to be shocked, that we're no different from Judas. Naturally speaking, we're not any different from him. That we too have our price. What it would take. I truly believe this. I know this is scandalous. But I truly believe that given the right circumstances, the right temptations, every one of us would hand Christ over, saying, no, I prefer to have that instead of him. That is our nature. mean, as I read about earlier, there's that conflict, and thank God there's that conflict. There is part of you that says, no, I would never want to do that. Just like Peter said, no, Lord, I'll never deny you. I mean, no, I'll never let that happen. I would never want that to happen. Thankfully, there is that part of us that's been awakened to some extent to his value, but the reality is simultaneously, there's also that part of us that is equally capable. And every expression of sin in our lives, which frankly, those expressions of sin are incalculable. Every one of those, whether it be the slightest little twinge of impatience, frustration, seemingly benign situations, road rage, or losing our temper with our kids, or arguing with our spouse angrily. I mean, every single expression of sin has that same root issue. Does that make sense? That it's saying, God, you're not enough for me. What you have is not enough for me. I prefer 30 pieces of something else to this. It's fascinating when you look at what plays out with Peter, and you can look at Luke's gospel for the most details on this, but what plays out with Peter, Jesus says to him, Peter, the devil, Satan, has desired to sift you like wheat. And he says, but I have prayed for you that your faith would remain. And when you're strengthened, when you come through this, I want you to strengthen your brethren. He's saying, look, the difference between Judas and Peter is Jesus, not Peter. The difference between Judas and you and me is Jesus, not you and me. And here we have a God who offers himself to us anyway. I mean, how amazing is that? I meet with people day after day after day, and I hear of stories of betrayal. I gave myself to him, to her. I spoke the vows during our wedding ceremony, and now he has violated, or she has violated, or he stabbed me in the back, or I thought he was a friend, and then he turned on me, and there's almost nothing harder for us in our human relationships than betrayal. And here's God saying, look, this is what you have done, are doing, and would always do to me if not for my grace, if not for my rescue in your life. And that's what we're beholding. We're beholding rescue. And Jesus says this is so important. This is what helps us appreciate communion, what we're about to experience together here in a few minutes. He says, verse 28, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for forgiveness of sins. This is about forgiveness. This is God saying, for all that rebellion, for betrayal that you can't even quantify, I am forgiving you. And to make it very clear that I'm forgiving you, I am giving a substitute who will take what you deserve for you to be assured that everything that stands between me and you, God says, has been dealt with. All sin, all the penalty for it has been absorbed. We have been reconciled. It says in the Bible, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And I wrestled through that this past week. We talked about it in Sunday school, and I don't know that I can even do it justice right now, but suffice it to say, this has to do with God saying, look, since the beginning I told you, you are worthy of death. Surely, in the day you partake of that fruit, you will die. We considered a few weeks ago at Easter Sunday, we turned the tables, and when we killed Christ, we said, no, you're worthy of death. And this is him saying, look, I am absorbing, I am taking death, so that you will know that the rift is been dealt with. The gap has been bridged. I have done what is necessary. I have put an end to the hostility by absorbing it within myself. So much more to say, and I'll have to think through that more thoroughly and try to articulate that better. But it's amazing that God sends his son who, though omnipotent in power, who could have stopped it, he allows himself to be betrayed, wrongly tried, found guilty, executed. He lets humans kill him. And that was that's what humans did/do in response to an extension of love from our Creator. And I know that as you hear that, something, because the same thing happens in me. It's like, I just don't, I don't think I don't view God that way, or I'm not that. I mean, even in my expressions of sin, I mean, there's hostility. Okay, some level, sort of intellectually, I can kind of accept that, but I don't feel like that's the case. That's what God says. This is the reality. It's the way it is. And He sent Christ to put an end to it. And then to assure us that forgiveness has been granted and secured for us through the death and resurrection of Christ, validating this sacrifice, this substitute has been accepted. I mean, there have been substitutes from the beginning when God says to Adam and Eve, you will surely die, and instead of killing them, He kills the animals to cover them with the skin. Remember that? And then there's a substitute with Abraham saying, sacrifice your son. And Abraham reluctantly, and all sorts of inner conflict goes up and goes to kill Isaac, and God says, stop. And then He says, there's this ram in the thicket. You take that ram, you kill the ram. This substitute. In the Passover, there's a substitute. You even see substitution in the Israelites. They get to the other side of the Red Sea after it's been parted and then brought back down, and all the Egyptians are drowned. And it says explicitly there in Exodus, and the Israelites looked back and saw the dead corpses of the Egyptians on the beach. The Israelites saw the dead corpses of the Egyptians there on the beach. And you know what? Probably at least a few of them said, that should have been me. If not for this miracle, that would have been me. On the cross, God says, it could have been you. But instead it was me. Substitution. Forgiveness granted. Think about this past week. What'd you think? What'd you say? What'd you do? And in our minds, because we have a minimized view of sin, we can probably pick out certain things. Like, I had that moment of outburst, or I was kind of anxious and I know I shouldn't have been. I wasn't trusting God, or I wasn't rejoicing. I mean, we can kind of pinpoint certain. If we saw them all, and God just says, look, I see it all, and it's all gone. It's all forgiven. It's all cleansed. The price has been paid. There's nothing, there's no enmity, there's no hostility. It's gone. It's covered. It's truly amazing. And Jesus is establishing here in this the reality that he gave Himself, and I think that's why He says what He said in John 6 that Don read earlier. When He says, I'll just summarize it, but He says, look, unless you eat this bread, unless you eat my body, unless you drink this wine or drink my blood, you have no life in yourself. He's not saying, I don't believe, that the bread and the juice that we drink once a month is His literal body and His literal blood. What I believe He is saying is, just as surely as you take that bread and eat it, that unleavened bread and eat it, and just as surely as you take that cup and drink it, just as surely as it literally goes down your throat and into your stomach and is a sustaining grace in your life, so also I came and lived in tangible flesh and blood and let myself be killed. And I am so close to you now that I'm literally in you, and that is your life. I am your life. Garden of Eden, that you eat it, you will surely, what? Die. Jesus says, unless you eat this bread and drink this wine or this body and this blood, all you've got is death. But when you take this in, there's a tangible, real expression of what has been done for you. A sign, a reminder of what has been done for you. That I have literally offered myself to you and am inseparably bound to you, and I am in you. And I am in you individually, and I am in you collectively. And he says, now you, my people, are a community. Same root word for communion. You are a community, catch this, of forgiveness. And I don't mean by that we always extend it, we always receive it, we always experience it. I don't mean that. I mean objectively, that is what is true of everyone in Christ collectively. We are a community of forgiveness, standing in the forgiveness of God, permanently in the forgiveness of God. And that is a truth to revisit over and over and over again, because the reality is, in these relationships, to get real personal here for you, okay, for a second. I don't want to make you too uncomfortable. The reality is, you spend a little time with me, I am going to sin against you. Guarantee it. But you're not all that great either, because you're going to sin against me too. He might be doing that right now, for all I know. I mean, we can't estimate it. We can't control it. It is the way it is down here. I'd say it at least once, Don. And here's what is objectively true. We are forgiven. I'm forgiven. Whether you like that or not, for what I've done, thought, said, done, you're forgiven. Our real issues are between us and God, right, Greg, anyway? God says, you're forgiven. And now in your human relationships within the body of Christ, you have this invitation and opportunity to walk in that forgiveness together. And stumble along and clumsily bang into each other and sin and hurt each other and so on and so forth. And we have unconditional love from God to share in with Him and to some varying degrees with each other. I'm going to read you this little quote here, this book, Law and Gospel, that a friend gave me last weekend. I've been working my way through it. And this caught my attention. You've heard me mention before. A psychologist named Brené Brown, years ago, gave one of the most popular TED Talks ever called The Power of Vulnerability. At that point in her life, she was outside of the church. My understanding is, and this book refers to it, that she's actually now in the church. I don't know what kind of church, but I know she would claim to be a believer in Jesus. And I thought this was interesting. They talk about her here in the section. I'll just read it to you. It says, author and shame researcher Brené Brown touched on this same dynamic when she talked about coming back to church after years away and the moment the whole Jesus thing finally clicked. So this is her saying she went back into the church to sort of experiment with the idea of vulnerability and community. Here's what she says. People would want love to be unicorns and rainbows. So then God sends Jesus and people say, wow, love is hard. Love is sacrifice. Love is trouble. Love is rebellious. As Leonard Cohen sings, and some of you probably heard this song, love is not a victory march. It's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. Love isn't hearts and bows. It is very controversial. And finally, she says, in order for forgiveness to really happen, something has to die. Whether it's your expectations of a person or your idea about who you are, there has to be a death for forgiveness to happen. In all these faith communities where forgiveness is easy and love is easy, some about the typical sentimental, shallow stuff, there's not enough blood on the floor to make sense of that. And the author of the book says, all of a sudden it becomes clear why Christians take the forgiveness of sins to heart. The blood on the floor is Christ's own blood. It is truly, I'm not trying to just exaggerate for effect here. It is truly mind-blowing that God did what he did. That he let us consider him worthy of death and even murder him in cold blood. It says, and that is your forgiveness. Let that blow your mind. Let's pray. If I can have my gentlemen come up to help pass out communion. God, thank you for your word, and thank you doesn't even come close to cutting it. Lord, we are dull and ignorant. And in the moments that we think about you and what you've done, we have little sort of trivial ways or limited understanding, and we clumsily bump around trying to make sense of it. And then there are many other moments in which it's the farthest thing from our minds. God, your extension of unconditional acceptance and love through Christ is truly amazing. Forgive us for our blinders to it. Forgive us for that remaining hostility when we want to, through law keeping or do's and don'ts, take control back, rip it out of your hands and secure for ourselves life. And God, you say, here is life. The blood of the Son of God given for you, the body of the Son of God broken for you. Help us to simply accept it, to accept this gift, to receive it as our food and our drink. Though we rejected you and would run far, far from you, you pursued us and insistently, relentlessly, even recklessly gave yourself back to us through Jesus and his amazing, incalculably loving sacrifice for us. As we eat this little piece of unleavened bread in a moment, God, help us to remember that there was a sinless substitute given for us. As we drink this blood, help us remember that his blood was shed for us, that he died in our place. Help us to appreciate new life we have in you. Help us to catch ourselves resistantly being drawn back to the skewed, perverted view of you that is more like Larry. Help us to remember that you've accepted us perfectly, more like Glenn, and to simply bask in, delight in, be amazed by, and worship your love. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.